Welcome back. Let's finish up this module. We're going to take a look at the steps involved in configuring auto deploy. This lesson, in fact, will cover the steps involved in configuring auto deploy and how to use the vSphere auto deploy to deploy your ESXi hosts. So here are the steps. Essentially, at a high level, we'll think about what do we need to do in order to get this started, right? So first thing is, before we even get started, we'll need to have images. So you need to make sure Image Builder has been utilized, or at least you're using the base ESX image, and you'll need to have at least one host profile in place in order to configure those hosts. And don't forget, you'll need what's called a host customization so that the ESX server can actually get its network information all from essentially an answer file. So now, once you have those prerequisites, now we'll go through what do you need for auto deploy to work. You need a DHCP server. Like we said, that could be your own current organization's DHCP server, or maybe you set one up on the management network for the purpose of auto deploy. You'll need to make sure the auto deploy service has been started. It's not enabled by default on vCenter. You'll need to make sure you have a proper TFTP server, right? So that's another thing you'll need in your environment, and you'll need to make sure you have the TFTP zip file that represents all of the different possible PXE boot files that are sent to the ESX servers after having their IP addresses given to them through DHCP. Then finally, we go ahead and create the rules in auto deploy, right? So that's the first part we're actually doing in the auto deploy section here, right? You turn the service on, then you go ahead and create rules. That's basically what you need. As long as you hand over the prerequisites, having host profiles, and you have an image profile, then basically setting up auto deploy is really just setting up these deployment rules and then activating them. Don't forget, once you have a rule in place, you can actually have multiple rules and decide which ones are active, which ones are inactive at any particular time. So first things first, a DHCP server. Now, of course, this is the Windows one. You can have whatever DHCP server you need. The important things here is that if you do have or for any one of your DHCP servers, you'll need to provide an IP address reservation, first of all, right? Because the hosts do need to have the same IP every time they boot up. But also make sure you've defined some additional elements here. You'll need to provide the boot server host name, who the TFTP boot server is, and the boot file name, right? So just two very important elements here. The host, once it's received its IP address, it needs to then contact the TFTP server to get the TFTP download. So you need two things: the IP address of the TFTP server and the name of the file, basically the PXE file that we'll use for auto deploy. The one specifically for your ESX servers is that one listed there, undinonly.kpxe.vmw-hardwired. And so that is the prerequisites on the DHCP server side. Now for the auto deploy service, you'll need to make sure the service is enabled. You can do this on the vSphere server management page. You can even do this in the vSphere client. When you first actually open up the menu to select auto deploy, it'll prompt you right there. Hey, the auto deploy service is not enabled. Do you want to enable it? Say yes. It'll enable everything. It'll enable the image builder service and the auto deploy service. Sure, you can actually manage this at the individual service level, but when you're in the vSphere client, when you open up the menu and select auto deploy, it will prompt you to start the appropriate services, which are basically auto deploy and the image builder. Now that your auto deploy service is up and running, clicking on a vCenter Service Configure tab, you'll find an auto deploy section that will give a downloadable link to the TFTP boot file zip, right? So this is a zip file of a couple different PXE files, but what you need to do is just download this file and place it on the server that's going to be your TFTP server that you specified in the DHCP server settings for the TFTP location. So that's an important piece here. Make sure this has been downloaded and placed on whatever server is your TFTP server. And of course, unzip that because we need now access to the files that are in there. Now, once we have those in place, it's time to create some deployment rules. Go back into your auto deploy section. We were in the software depot section earlier, right? Now we move over to deploy rules, and where you can go ahead and create a new deployment rule and specify what are the criteria that determines which image the host is going to get and which host profile the image is going to get. So when you select to create a new deploy rule, you give the rule name and then specify what are the conditions which ESX servers are going to get this thing. Now you can create one rule that determines the image, and you can have another rule for the host profile. They can be built into quite a few different rules, just as long as the ones that you want to utilize are activated. So like I said, you can have quite a few different rules. Don't forget to activate the ones you need before you go ahead and auto deploy your servers. So how do you know, okay, if I'm going to have a host profile rule, I'll need to specify probably the MAC address of a host to determine which host profile and which answer file the host should receive. So when you add the hosts that match a following pattern, you're specifying one of the different things that an ESX server sends to auto deploy when they make their initial boot request. So as we mentioned, you can provide the IP address of that host, you can provide their MAC address, their host name, their make and model, their serial number. There's a pretty big list of criteria that you can use to match for which host profile or which image profile you want to send down. Then you specify, well, what is it that this rule is actually going to determine? Is it going to determine which host profile we're going to send, which image we're going to send? You can specify each one of these in the same host profile, in the same deployment rule, or you can create different rules for different things to send down to a host. But don't forget, once you have that rule created, it's going to show as an italicized name, right? So here we call the rule SA deploy rule. It's italicized. If it's italicized, that's your sign to inform you it is not activated yet, right? It actually says it right next to it, it's inactive. So once you've created the rule, don't forget the next thing you're going to need to do is activate it. So once you have the rule in place, click on the activate, deactivate rules, specify the rule that you want to have activated by hitting the up arrow to move it into the active set. And now we can actually see what happens here. This is a deploy rule that is going to look at incoming boot requests for any host that boots up with this IP address. That's our criteria, right? That's our pattern. It's going to send this image profile. It's going to send a host profile called local profile. And you're also telling it where it's going to be deployed in your environment. So this is a folder on vCenter called auto deployed hosts. You can put it wherever you want. If you want to go in a cluster, you can specify where it's going to go. These are three different possible things that this rule is defining. Now we've actually built this all into one big rule that determines the image, the host profile, and the location in the inventory. You could have done this differently. You could have had one rule that determines the image, another rule that determines the host profile, and a third rule that determines the location. Usually the location is probably tied with one of the other rules anyway. But that's what you're able to define here, is exactly how this is going to be imaged, configured, and then placed in your vSphere environment. So once you have that, right, if you ever change a rule, well, then what happens, right? If you change a rule, it says, okay, I want to change it so that this range of IP addresses now get a different image. Well, that's not going to change any ESX servers that have already been deployed. It doesn't matter if they're stateless or stateful. The hosts are deployed, they're going to keep the image until they ever shut down, right? So if you change a rule, which basically means you're updating something that the rule is referring to change that at a host, you simply reboot your stateless host, or you reboot your stateless cached host. If you change the rule and the result is for a stateful host, well, that host is never going to look at that rule again, right? You're going to have to update that host through Lifecycle Manager instead. Of course, with just a reminder here, stateless caching and stateful installs don't need the vCenter server's uptime as much as a stateless host would. Hence the whole point of why we like the stateless caching. Now, we do mention Update Manager here. This really should be referring to Lifecycle Manager. And remember, one of the things about Update Manager was that it only was able to patch ESX servers or update their firmware, but it wasn't able to do a full image update. That's really where the big change in vSphere 7 has come in, where this new Lifecycle Manager, which can now specify that a cluster has a specified image, which could have been built by Image Builder, and then we can actually leverage the auto deploy service to push the image down to the hosts, so that a host may actually have been statefully installed, but we can maintain it in a very similar way using Lifecycle Manager from a centralized perspective. That makes that Lifecycle Manager much more useful in large-scale environments. So you'll be learning more about Lifecycle Manager. Actually, we cover that in the install class, so we should have already had a chance to play around with it if you've seen the install class for vSphere 7. So that ends our lesson. We took a look at the configuration steps to auto-deploy and using auto-deploy to deploy your hosts. Thank you, and we'll see you in another class.